Hi there, and welcome to the next episode of the Value Through Vulnerability podcast, a human-centered podcast from the Listening Organization. And today, I am more than excited to have someone called Mr. Garry Ridge on the other side of the world with me. Hello there, Garry.
Hey, g'day, Gary. How are you?
I am very, very well. And I think you're a man that needs no introduction, but I'll just do a very brief one, which is I am very grateful to have Garry with me as probably one of the best servant leaders that I've come across in the last number of years as I've woken up in this space, and he's CEO of the WD-40 company. So, Garry, is there anything else you'd like to expand on as to my listeners as to sort of who you are, and maybe what you're passionate about, maybe in a bit more detail?
Oh, yeah, well, I know what I'm passionate about. I'm really passionate about creating a place where people go to work every day, they make a contribution to something bigger than themselves, they learn something new, they feel safe, and they go home happy. And the reason I'm passionate about it is that, you know, I think it's a sin that 65% of people go to work every day and they hate their jobs. And that's the fault of leadership, because we create that toxic culture. So that's why I'm delighted to be here with you today to share some of the learnings that we've had over time as we've built this wonderful culture at WD-40 Company, which is not about me. It's about the wonderful tribe members who come here and play every day.
Oh, that's lovely. You mentioned that it's been a journey. So you've been with WD-40 now just over 30 years, Garry, I believe?
This is my 32nd year. It seems like just yesterday.
What has shifted for you? Before we get into a bit more of the nuts and bolts of your journey, if you went sort of when you came in as CEO, or maybe the other roles you had within WD-40 compared to where you are now, what are some of those key pivot points, do you think, between where you were and where you are now with the WD-40 tribe?
Well, I know one that's very, very, dominant in my thinking. I joined in '87 down in Australia to open our subsidiary there. I worked from '87 to '94 in Australia. In '94, I moved to the US, and in '97, I got to be given the opportunity to lead this tribe. And there are a few things that became very clear to me at that time. The first one was that micromanagement wasn't scalable. And at that time, about 90% of our business was in the United States. And we believed that we could take our blue and yellow can with a little red top to the world, and we weren't going to do that by being micromanagement. So we had to create a culture that set people free, but also gave them guardrails to keep them safe. So that pivot was a big pivot in my mind. I went back to school, and I really needed to get an understanding of what this servant leadership thing was, because I believed that if we weren't going to be able to micromanage, freedom was very important, and servant leadership to me sounded like freedom. So I went back to school. I went to the University of San Diego. I started my master's degree there in leadership, and that's where I met my now dear friend Ken Blanchard. And Ken has definitely been a huge influence on my thinking over time. He is probably the servant leader master of the world. And Ken and I, as you probably know, later on wrote a book together called Helping People Win at Work. But it was, that learning that was very, very, very important. And what it did do was give me confidence to be able to try this thing called servant leadership.
It's really fascinating for me, Garry. What was it for you back then? That realization for you that micromanagement wasn't scalable, was that just from sort of just experience, or was it, was there a lack of expansion? Was there just like people's thinking? What was going on for you at that point?
Well, we needed to grow outside of the United States, and we were primarily a US-based company, and I was consciously incompetent like I am now, and I wasn't able to do this on my own. So if I couldn't gather people around me that were much better than I was able to be, then there was no way. And I didn't speak German or Chinese or French or Italian, and how are we going to build this infrastructure to be able to do that? So it was really an understanding that we had to create a culture that empowered people.
That really speaks to this podcast, Garry, because as you know, it's called Value Through Vulnerability, and I think for you, even back then, to have suddenly gone, hang on, I can't do this on my own. I think that's part of the challenge, isn't it, for leadership even today, is to be able to say, I don't have all the answers.
Well, I think, Garry, you've heard me say, and I've written about this a lot, the three most powerful words I've ever learned in my life: I don't know. and getting comfortable with that. And, we've talked about vulnerability a little bit in the past, and I know you asked me, what is vulnerability? And I know what it doesn't mean. Vulnerability doesn't mean weakness. It's getting comfortable with I don't know. And people have this fear, negative fear of people not really believing that they are competent, or believing that they are inadequate because they show their vulnerability, and vulnerability really is I don't know. And that's driven by ego. And if you think about ego, it's self. If you say someone is full of ego, they're full of self. So, we've got to get ego out, we've got to get vulnerability in, and we've got to remove the fear that is within people, that vulnerability means that someone is accusing them of being inadequate or not able to deliver, which is completely, I've found out, completely wrong.
Yeah, that resonates so much with me. And I think, if I look at my experience, I mentioned to you before we came on, Garry, that, it took me to the age of 39 to suddenly go, actually, it's okay to talk about emotion, at home, but also the workplace. It's really as recent as that for me.
Yeah, and it is. We, at the end of the day, we're just, simple human beings bumbling our way down the path of life, bumping into stuff. And we try to, really camouflage issues with confusion to make out how smart we are. And, as Simon Sinek and I have talked about a lot, building culture is simple, not easy, and time is not your friend. And if you adopt some simple practices like, we talk about care, candor, accountability, and responsibility. If you care for people, care is about, number one, having a servant leadership philosophy, which means that you are going to both serve and be a leader. Servant leadership, doesn't mean the prisoners are running the prison. Servant leadership is serve and lead. And the leadership part of that is you've got to ensure that you have, a robust business plan, that you're sensible about the way you allocate time, talent, treasure, and technology, because you have to build an economic engine to enable you to serve your people. So, servant leadership around care is very important. And candor is pretty simple. No lying, no faking, no hiding. Most people don't lie. A lot of people fake and hide. Why? Because they're afraid. Our dear friend Tracy Fenton talks about what would you do if you weren't afraid? Well, what people do when they're afraid is they lie and they fake. They lie and they fake to themselves, and they lie and they fake to their people. The next one is accountability. What do you expect of me, and what may I expect from you? And is there clarity around that? Do we have a clear understanding? And are we brave enough to be able to talk about that together? Not because we want to in any way, not be supportive of each other, because we want to support each other. And then finally is responsibility. Are we going to do what we say we were going to do? We're going to build trust by being, someone who does what they say they're going to do. So, there's 4 simple pillars that you can use to build a culture that creates an environment where people actually like to go to work every day.
It's lovely. I'm really intrigued, because anyone listening to us now, maybe that there's organisations I know quite close to me, Garry, that I think they're starting on this journey. They're starting to wake up to actually, wow, we can get even better performance if we start with our people rather than just the metric at the end. What would you say to someone that might be listening to us now talk, okay, it's nice for other people, but I don't think it's for me? Is there any case of servant leadership that's been a negative in your experience today?
I think the negative of servant leadership is where you get out of balance between being tough-minded and tender-hearted. When people think that servant leadership is 100% being tender-hearted, that's wrong. It's like when we bring up our kids. We love our kids, but sometimes we've got to be a little tough. So the genius is getting a balance between being tough-minded and tender-hearted. And I think a lot of people, when they hear the word servant leadership, they think of soft and mushy and no results, and it's all about kumbaya and hugging and stuff. No, it's about creating an environment where you create an enormously successful economic outcome that supports the business structure so you can support the, as we call them, the tribe. Now, 20 some years ago, I didn't know this was going to work, but I can tell you today, it worked. We've gone from an employee engagement number that was as ugly as most people's are today to an employee engagement number of 93%, which is, world class. 99% of our tribe members globally say they love to tell people they work at WD-40 Company. Oh, and by the way, we're a public company, so we are judged by our investors. Over that period of time, we've had a compounded annual growth rate of total shareholder return in excess of 10%. And in the last 10 years, it's been 20%. And in the last 5 years, it's been 27%. So I have an absolute case to say that if you build employee engagement through a servant leadership culture, you will produce a result much better than those that don't do that.
It gets these little hairs on end, Gary. Not that I've got many of them left, because we spoke before when I've been over with you and Tracy in the past. I think the thing that blows me away, I need people to hear what you just said. As a publicly traded company, you can make these results. I think because so often with the short termers of the markets, everything's the next quarter. How do you manage those relationships with your investors, and how do you sort of make sure that you keep your investors in? Because ultimately, you're bucking the trend of the market, aren't you? In essence.
Well, one of the things we talked about too is what's inspiring me most right now, and I'll tell you what's inspiring me most is that finally, the market is starting to talk about purpose-driven organizations. BlackRock probably owns more company stock than any investment house in the world. Their CEO, Larry Fink, has been writing now for 2 years about we are looking at companies that have a purpose-driven culture. So suddenly they're starting to talk about it. But I jokingly talk about two people when I do some public speaking. They are Al, the soul-sucking CEO, and Sam, his cousin, and that's short-sighted Sam. So short-sighted Sam actually works in Wall Street, and Al is the CEO who sucks up the short-sighted Sam all the time. So if you have Al, the soul-sucking CEO, and short-sighted Sam, you're never going to build an organization that has high employee engagement.
I know it's a new one on me, Gary. The soul sucking. I love the Sam. I love the cohort Sam. Brilliant. Love that.
Yeah.
If you were looking at your people, I love the engagement scores. Like I said, I've seen you firsthand the stuff you're doing, which is incredible. If someone is falling out of sort of congruence with themselves, they know the culture, they know the tribe, but maybe they're thinking, actually, so maybe I need time for a new tribe. How does that manage internally? What sort of opportunities are there for people to sort of shift teams, to shift different parts of the business, or even if it's just their time to move on? How does the tribe manage that out of interest?
Well, our number one goal is we want people to be happy in life, and hopefully they can be happy here. But nothing gives us more joy than to see someone either move up in the organization, or if they have to, move out of the organization to make a bigger difference somewhere else. We've got a wonderful example, or a number of wonderful examples about how people have moved through the organization. One that was just recent was Grace, who was just appointed the general manager of our China operation. Now, Grace was our first employee in China 15 years ago. She joined as an administrative assistant. And in that time, she's worked through a number of roles in the company. We helped her. She went into human resources. She then went into supply chain management. We sponsored her to do a master's degree in supply chain at the University of Shanghai. She moved from that to sales. And now, 15 years later, she is the general manager of our fastest growing subsidiary in the world. Now, there are a number of stories I can tell you like that, but it also means that it plays into what we're about. Is we want to develop our people. We're a learning organization. The number one responsibility of a tribal leader is to be a learner and a teacher. That's what our job is. So if you look at our tribe and you look at the model we use around tribal leadership, the number one thing that's on the top of the list is we are committed as leaders to be learners and teachers.
Just beautiful, just absolutely beautiful. I love this. It always gets me when I talk to you, Garry, to the point that I've shared it with people when I've come back from your San Diego site before, that it's quite moving. It's a very moving facility that you have in San Diego because of the way it's designed and how intentional it is around your people. How important for you is it a curiosity out of interest in terms of a human trait to help you evolve, both them evolve as individuals, but also for you as a wider organization?
Thanks for that question, Garry. I just finished, actually, when I was on holiday this year in Fiji, I just finished reading a book. Do you remember Spencer Johnson, who wrote Who Moved My Cheese? Yeah. There was a follow-on to that. Spencer passed away, and his children wrote a book called The Way Out of the Maze. And they talk about notice your beliefs. And they say a belief is a thought that you trust to be true. So I believe that curiosity is about questioning yourself. Why do I believe this to be true? Because sometimes facts are just how you see things. So our curiosity, particularly in the way that business continues to change today, our curiosity has to be on high alert because business is changing. And I think with that, you have to be brave. And brave to me is consider carefully and act boldly. So I think it's curiosity, which is why do I believe what I believe, and then consider carefully and act boldly.
I love it. And sort of following on from that, Garry, for you personally, where do you get the most joy for you as CEO? Where do you get where's the most learning for you personally? Because I can imagine you continue to grow every day within the role that you do as well.
Well, you asked two questions there. The first one is, where do I get the most joy? From my people. Coming to work and just getting to play with these brilliant tribe members every day is something that I am so grateful for. People often say, you're busy, Garry. I say, I'm not busy. I'm rejoicing in an abundance of worthwhile work. And that's how I see the work we do every day. So the joy comes from there. What was the second half of the question?
Yeah, so in terms of how do you get your growth as well? So how do you feel your own growth? And maybe give us an example of what you've learned, something new, some new insight you've gained in the last.
Well, there's a number of areas. One of the ways I get a lot of learning is I teach. I teach at the University of San Diego. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania. I teach at San Diego State University. And there's nothing like being in a room full of very inquisitive learners. You learn a lot from them. And then just being aware. Picking on, there's so many new things we can learn from today. Look at the digital landscape and e-commerce. And, I think learning is a choice. You either choose to be open to it or you adopt the fact that you know it all. And remember, the most powerful words I've ever learned in my life are, I don't know. And every day I get up and say, I'm consciously incompetent.
When did you first realize, when was that first moment for you when you suddenly went, actually, it's okay to not know? Was that a certain point in your life, Garry, out of interest?
I think I got very comfortable with it back in 1997, when I got to lead the company, when it was very clear to me that I didn't know. And I thought, okay, so am I going to be ignorant to this not knowing, or am I just going to admit it? And interestingly enough, when I admitted it, all the knowledge surrounded me, and that is very powerful.
That's amazing. As we look to wrap up, Garry, would you mind sharing, is there anything in particular you'd like to leave my listeners with? Is there a particular sort of reflection of yours, of your journey to date, or maybe just a bit of advice for you that you could give to my listeners, bearing in mind the context of the podcast around it being very, very human-centered?
Well, I think we as leaders have the opportunity, a bit more than ever before, to change the world, because we get up every day and create environments where we can either have people go home happy or not go home happy. And, a happy person creates a happy family. A happy family creates a happy community. A happy community creates a happy world. And more than ever, we need a happy world.
And do you see that as every single one of our responsibility, Garry, as well as outside of leadership?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Life's a gift. Don't send it back unwrapped.
Beautiful. Love that. Well, look, you've been an absolute joy, Garry, as always. Where can people sort of contact you if they want to follow up or just follow a bit more of your work?
I have a website, www.thelearningmoment.net. I also publish on LinkedIn, so if anybody wants to follow me on LinkedIn, they can find me on LinkedIn. So they're probably the two best places.
Fantastic. Garry, again, thank you so much for sparing the time.
Yeah, pleasure.
All the best for now. Take care.
Cheers.